Hey there, folks. Welcome to the Crazy Libertarian here on 88.1 FM, proudly serving the Fargo-Moorhead community. Got a great show for you here today. You're going to enjoy this. Now, I know that kind of the news of the last few years with all the crazy stuff that's been going on has been the impeachment proceedings against President Donald Trump. Now, it seems like since day one, he's kind of had these following him. I mean, I think it was like the day after his election, several notable Democrats said that they would be looking to impeach. So it's been going on for a while. And I just kind of wanted to... It seems like libertarians are kind of caught here because we're like, Trump is doing all this horrible stuff, but it's not really that much different. So with that, I kind of want to get into like looking at this over the last few years, with the whole Trump thing. It started with Russia, and then it kind of migrated to Ukraine, and there's been all these weird gray areas, and it's questions of is it bribery, is it not bribery, what exactly is going on here? And truth be told, that's all pretty difficult to parse out. I mean, calling it for how I see it, was it unethical? Yeah. Impeachment worthy? Is it politically risky for the Democrats because of how long they've dragged it out? Yeah. And I'll just get this out of the way real quick because I know everyone's like, well, what's it going to do for 2020? Let's pretend that you are. And I know that I think that the Democrats have really they've blown it at this point. I mean, it's kind of like in football, even if you have the greatest running back of all time, you can only keep going off the left tackle for so long. Eventually you need to call a play action pass. Democrats haven't done that for a very long time. And so I think that as fatigued as we are as a people at this point of the constant media news bursting cycle, I think that they've kind of overplayed their hand, and I think that it just won't work on voters in 2020. I mean, after 4 years of it, 4 years with like not the amount of proof that one might like to see over 4 years, I think it's really going to bite them. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I don't really give a rat's ass about what Trump is doing in Ukraine or what he did or didn't do in Russia or any of that. Because this brings up a larger point. What's Trump done that's impeachable? Hell, what's Trump done that hasn't been impeachable? What's Obama done that wasn't impeachable, by the way? George W. Bush. Going back, Clinton, H.W. Bush. I mean, look at our policies. Look at policies that have become regular, commonplace, and have been acquiesced by Congress. Look at the wars that we fought. We're still in the Middle East off of the authorization of military force signed 2 decades ago almost. Look at the drug wars that have failed. Look at how enthusiastic the presidents were for decades to be pro-law and order, and to continue arresting millions of innocent civilians who've done nothing wrong than commit a nonviolent crime that was based off of some racist druggery in the first place. I mean, not to mention the trillions of dollars of debt they're ringing up, the trillions that they're stealing from future generations by ringing up the credit card today. Look at all this ridiculous stuff. And so we're concerned over a little deal in Ukraine? I just kind of feel like that's not telling the whole truth. Because guess what? Like, we've been at war for at least 3 presidents now. I mean, we've been at war unofficially for decades and stuff. But strictly going back to Iraq, number 2, and Afghanistan, we've been at war since the year 2000? And we still have troops in the Middle East, and it's still being destabilized, and Congress still hasn't voted on a declaration of war. We voted on 1 or maybe 2 authorizations of military force, maybe 3, over an 18-year time frame. I'm sorry, I don't know what the hell everyone else is smoking, but that's crazy. We used to protest against that. We used to have generational songs about the bombs that we were dropping, and we're still dropping bombs, and we're still killing people. This doesn't even get into the arms that we're selling, the blood that we have on our hands. I just went and saw Senator John Hoeven speak last week at the Prairie Den in downtown Fargo, and he was talking up how much money we're making selling drones and helping our allies. Essentially, Saudi Arabia is considered a strategic ally. And it's ridiculous. And and I'm just so offended that this is what we're going to go after impeachment over. If you want to talk about impeachment, they've all been impeachable. And you know what? If you want to go back further, then you could make the argument that we really didn't have any business being in Iraq the first time either. I understand that Kuwait was an ally, but I didn't see a declaration of war. And it's just so ridiculous. And by the way, something that further destabilized the region and led to the events on 9/11, not to mention. And so if you want to go back even further, you can look at the nonsense, as I'm sure listeners on 88.1 FM are keenly aware of, that we've done in Latin America, the banana republics, which we're still, we're not doing to the same extent that we did decades ago, but you can believe that the United States government would do that exact same thing if they could. Look at what we've done in Libya. This is just ridiculous. Millions of people have died because of this, by the way. This has serious real-life implications. You can go back to El Salvador in the 1980s, and you can go back into, if you want to go back very far, you can go back in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. There's just decades of America fumbling around the world, making life worse for people. And Congress hasn't voted on a damn war since World War II. So why is it that we're sending people to die? And why is it that we're not asking this kind of question very often? I heard it from Tulsi Gabbard. I occasionally hear it from Andrew Yang and a couple people in the Republican Party. But why is this such a rare topic? Damn it, if we're going to be talking about impeachment, shouldn't we be talking about when we're killing our own soldiers off of faulty reasoning? Damn, that sounds pretty impeachable to me. We have 22 veterans that kill themselves a day in this country that can't get access to help. But we can still continue to find a reason to fight these stupid, counterproductive wars? Yeah, that sounds pretty frickin' impeachable, actually. And then let's not even cover the, decades-old racially motivated drug war, right? We have very solid evidence that a lot of the drug war was based on racist fear-mongering from day one. Henry Anslinger lied to Congress off of the fear that because his prohibition was shut down, that he needed something else to target, and he got them to target specifically the Latin American and black communities for marijuana usage in the 1930s, leading to reefer madness, and it's been the same ever since. And it doesn't take an incredible amount of knowledge to put this together, by the way, right? This is all kind of public knowledge at this point. Pretty accessible. And then not to mention the logical harms that it's doing, right? The millions of people that have been locked up because of this, lives ruined, families torn apart. And by the way, if you are very pro-life and you're listening, one of my little pet peeves here that I was thinking about before the show is, where the hell are all the pro-lifers on the drug war? Because do you know what would really, really, really reduce the number of abortions? If we stop tearing apart inner city families and leading to the situations that induce a tragic decision to induce an abortion in the first place. When people have stable families and jobs and outlooks on life and aren't being torn apart by an oppressive police state, they have more opportunities to care for a family. But I digress. Why are we not more upset about these things? Why is this not something that we're talking about? Why are we just now talking about ending the federal prohibition on marijuana? Why aren't we talking about going after the sons of bitches that lied about it and ruined millions of lives in the process? I'm willing to bet that and I hate to be one of those people that crawls back to our founders all the time, but if they were here, they'd say that's pretty damn impeachable. This is ridiculous. And then here's the thing that's really done it, right? This is where it's going to get a little bit nerdy here. But it's because Congress has systematically and determinably orchestrated away and given away their powers on these issues. They've given away their power to wage war. They've given away their power to regulate things. They've given away their power to write laws with how they with certain rules that pretty much say that any decision goes to the regulatory agency. So what's this mean? Means that we have a real problem, and there are some things that we should really be changing in America. But with what Donald Trump's been doing recently, it's only the ugliest, maybe the most convenient for the left politically to go off of symptom, if you will. Because Congress needs to make being political hard again. Congress needs to be a place where people actually debate ideas instead of arguing over pointless little petty debates and then voting along near unanimously to reauthorize the Patriot Act, for example, which happened relatively recently, just so you're aware. My point being, we need to hold Congress accountable, and we need to shrink the power of the executive. That is absolutely essential. But guess what? No one wants to talk about it. No one even wants to talk about how we get back to that spot. No one even cares. No one even cares that the executive has so much power. The fact that any president has this much power is freaking impeachable at this point. They're governing like kings. Executive orders are essentially rewrites of law at this point. It's ridiculous, the policy variations that happen between president to president. And what's even more ridiculous is that of the policy variations that they could possibly do, killing less people and spending less pointless money is never the thing that they seem to choose. So why is it that we've focused in on this weird Ukraine-Russia deal? That's an open-ended question, because I seriously can't figure it out, because it just doesn't make sense. Of all the things to be outraged about, millions of people locked up, millions of civilians dead, this is a circus that we choose to focus on. And then, I really want to bring up, I'm going to get a little bit nerdy here, but, if you read the Constitution, a plain reading of it really doesn't make sense for how the federal government got this big, right? We're going to talk about that later in the show. But the federal government was supposed to have, according to, the Federalist Papers and everything, when it was actually voted on, it was supposed to be a fairly contained deal. But there's a couple of sections in the Constitution that have been totally blown out of proportion. Now I'm going to talk about them for a little bit, just so I can talk about how wrong this is and how sick this rot has gotten into not only our political landscape, but our judicial landscape. And if there's some stuff that we need to be overturning, it definitely goes beyond a few conversations that Trump may or may not have had. So the first is what's called the Necessary and Proper Clause of the U.S. Constitution. I'm not going to bore you. Bear with me for 30 seconds. It pretty much states that Congress has the power to enact any laws necessary and proper to exercise their given authority. Now, over the years, this has been expanded, and pretty much anything is a necessary and proper clause, because if they claim that it's for the general welfare, which is another clause in the Constitution, then they can pretty much finnick their way into anything. And another thing is the Interstate Commerce Clause, the old ICC, if you've ever taken AP history or anything like that, to which was amended in the 40s under that socialist, I take that back, that fascist FDR, in order to say that even a farmer growing wheat on his own farm to feed his family falls under the federal government's jurisdiction, because it could theoretically go into the marketplace, and that's interstate commerce because it affects prices and a whole lot of leaps and hoops. So these are the things that have become normalized in our society. No impeachment can really fix that. If we want to talk about it, yeah, we should be getting at the son of a guns that are abusing their authority. But man, thinking that we can impeach one guy, or even even if we could throw out 50 or 60 of them, we have a very big problem to deal with. And the first part of solving any problem is, of course, acknowledging that you have one. So I just really want to bring it back to, so what's so impeachable about Donald Trump and really any president? Pretty much anything that they've done over the last, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 decades. Because if you go back to really the start of how the federal government interacts with us, the New Deal in the 1930s, FDR had to threaten to pack the United States Supreme Court and effectively overrule the votes of the justices that were on that court in order to get these new programs labeled as constitutional. We've been living with the fallout of this since well before we were born. We're going on 90 years of this now. And we are still suffering not only financially, but also constitutionally. And so, of course, we're going to treat every president, talking about Trump, and he was talked about being impeached from since day one when he was first elected. Of course, we're going to have these discussions, and of course, everything is going to be a nuclear football when you give the executive so much authority. Of course, people are going to go crazy over it. Of course, it's going to be my team needs to win and your team needs to lose by 20 points. Because when you give one person that much power, even if you trust him, even how the liberals, that's changing now kind of, but trusted Obama and the right really trusted W. Bush after 9/11, it's always going to go around to the other side. In case you partisans listening haven't figured this out yet, we kind of go on 4 to 8 year cycles in this country between the parties. And so any expansion of power that they take up inevitably gets taken up by the side that will work to undo the very things that you've just done and will work to target you. Let's not forget that the United States federal government has a long history of targeting those that it disagrees with, going back to the 30s when Hoover was sicked on people that could be considered communists, to the IRS tax scandal of the last decade. What all of this ties into is that we have given this behemoth on the executive side more and more power and more of our rights and more leeway, and it hasn't worked. Not only has it not worked out for us, not only is it insane and angering and all of those things that we talked about, but if you think the wrong things, and if you say the wrong words, and if you have the wrong beliefs, these powers will be used against you. It's not when they'll be used against you. I swear on my life, if we keep going down this path, there are some of you that are listening that will be targeted for very specific reasons. One of the terrible things about AI is China, well, as the Uyghurs in China and Hong Kong is learning, is it allows for really awful tracking and awful 1984-like detention spaces. Any power that the executive has, they can use against you. I know I've been kind of critical of Trump. I know some people love him. I personally think that he speaks with about the eloquence of a third grader, and I think an actual third grader would have much more business being president, because at a certain point they just go in for lunch and forget about it, which I think would be best for all of us if Donald Trump could just golf out the remainder of his term. That would be swell. Let's send all of Congress with him. We'll work it out in the meantime. But here's the thing. Every Democrat that made an excuse for Obama's executive authority, you made Trump happen. Every Republican that voted for Trump as a joke or because he just couldn't stand Hillary, by electing this egomaniac who will probably win in 2020, because as we've talked about earlier, the Democrats don't know how to run a candidate, but that's a conversation for another day. So you have two sides that hate each other, that are just waiting to use this big, strong executive to rip each other apart. No matter what state they're in, people in Texas want to rip California apart, people in California want to rip people in North Dakota apart, people in North Dakota want to rip people on the East Coast apart. This is ridiculous. And now this ever-expanded and ever-polarizing country that we're living in is governed under that single growing executive. At a time when we've seen in China horrible human rights abuses going on, and we've seen in our own country in the last decades, not to mention the horrible cases of police brutality that occur on the local and state level, systematic oppression of individuals. If you think that you might be out of the majority in the future, you will be. If you think that you might want to say something that's unpopular in the future, you will. If you think that you might want to someday stand up for your rights, might as well check all the boxes, because you will at some point. Then this should terrify you. We've allowed so much power to be coalesced at the top, and we have almost no regulation of it, and Congress has knowingly, wittingly, and willingly given way to it, not to mention the courts for decades now, because of that one fascist FDR in the 30s, haven't been able to properly, and they've done the best they can in certain circumstances, but for very serious government altering programs, they weren't able to give their honest opinion. we've got more to impeach than just Trump on Ukraine here. We've got a lot going on, America. This is a slow way train crash to hell. This is terrifying. This should be scary. And it's all been slow. It's been a creep, and most of the time you haven't noticed. Well, now that people finally are paying attention to the concept of holding an executive to any type of standard, it just happens to be for really, really, really questionable reasons. So what's my little nugget of advice? Should we be mad about what's happening in Ukraine, whether you believe that Hunter Biden is innocent or guilty, or whether you believe that the Trumps are innocent or guilty? Yeah, I'm saying that there could be a story there. But the far bigger danger and story and threat to each and every one of you has been the expansion of the president's authority to act unilaterally and to use large segments of the federal government any way they see fit. In an increasingly polarized and politicized world, this is a definite threat to free people. So I assume because you're listening to the Crazy Libertarian that you either assume that I'm a nut job or that I occasionally have a couple good ideas. If I have any good ideas, it's this: that a free society enables you to say unpopular things without fear of official retribution. Well, guess what? Do you know what creates a type of climate where you can no longer act in a totally free manner? A large, bloated state that hasn't had to fight for any of its power, has seemingly had it fed to it by both the judiciary and the legislative branches. This does not end well for us, folks. So, should we impeach Trump? Probably. Should it be for Ukraine? Maybe. Should we be scared, and should we start doing something beyond the sound bites? God, yes. As long as one troop's in the Middle East without an authorization of war from Congress, we need to get whoever the hell's in the White House, get them to the Senate, and get them the hell out of there. Until that happens, we'll always have an impeachable president. This has been the Crazy Libertarian, and signing off with my rant there. Let's just impeach everyone. Hey there, folks. Welcome back to the Crazy Libertarian. This is your always crazy host, and always principled at that, Bradley Foster. And today, for your Wednesday morning, I have a very special guest, a good friend of mine, Mr. Ezra Gray, president of Young Americans for Liberty at NDSU. So, Ezra, introduce yourself a little bit, man.
Thanks for having me, Brad. Yeah, my name is Ezra Gray. I'm currently a student at North Dakota State University, and I'm the current president of the Young Americans for Liberty chapter over at NDSU. I'm currently studying politics and history.
So, talking about Young Americans for Liberty, which is kind of a vague-sounding thing, what exactly are you guys about? Tell us a little bit about your organization for those that probably don't know.
So Young Americans for Liberty is an organization that has chapters all across the U.S. and various different college and university campuses. We're all about spreading the message of personal freedom, of liberty, of economic freedom, constitutionalism, all that great stuff.
So, talking about that, one of the things that's been, even if you haven't been following the news very well, it's been very apparent that let's just say the attitudes at most universities aren't very favorable towards people that we would, laughably call conservatives, but even more strictly to those of us that actually have beliefs in limited government. So why don't you kind of walk us through sort of what's been happening with free speech on campuses and some of the stuff like that?
Yeah, so at a lot of college campuses across the United States, university faculty and administration have been creating these speech codes. They've been implementing things called free speech zones, where you're not allowed to exercise your First Amendment right to assemble and freely speak unless you're in these areas. NDSU itself is, in my opinion, better than a lot of other campuses, especially on the coasts, but there are still several policies and rules at NDSU that I personally think are in direct violation of the First Amendment.
What would you say that some of those are?
So, for one, to freely assemble, if you want to hold some sort of political rally or assembly or protest event on NDSU campus, you have to get permission from the faculty at NDSU. You have to submit it, I think it's 48 hours in advance, and they have to approve of it, and you have to do it in designated areas. And personally, I think that's ridiculous because NDSU is a land-grant university. It is tax-funded land. It is public land. And you should be able to exercise your constitutional right on public land. And they just simply have blatantly anti-First Amendment policies.
Now, when you say anti-First Amendment policies, is this something that's been, you say that NDSU is bad, but other campuses have been worse. What kinds of things have been happening at some of those? What are some of the things that you're hearing through the grapevine on other campuses?
Yeah, so a lot of Young Americans for Liberty chapters have been doing, we have this kind of signature thing we do called a free speech ball, where we get a 7-8 foot tall beach ball, we inflate it, and we roll it around campus, and we let people write whatever they want to do on it, as is their First Amendment right. And then, sometimes it hasn't happened to us personally at NDSU, but I've seen instances with other Yale chapters across the country where faculty from the university will come up to them and they'll try to shut them down. They'll try to stop them from exercising their First Amendment rights. And a lot of times, these campuses get taken to court by an organization called FIRE, which specializes in suing and taking universities to court over the First Amendment right. And I think they've won around 50 court cases about it in recent years.
Interesting. So you've got this kind of anti-First Amendment, if you will, like a growing tide against the First Amendment on college campuses. So we've kind of talked about what's become of it. What would you in particular like to see us do, whether it be as a nation, as a university, as individuals? What do you think are some steps that we can take to really kind of stop the tide? Because, as speaking as a radio host on a small local radio media station, the First Amendment is pretty much all I got going for me.
Yeah, I think in the broadest sense, as a nation, ourselves and our governments, the people we elect into our government, should really be adhering to the Constitution, to constitutional rules. The Constitution is the highest law in the land. It is there for a reason. It lays out duties and restrictions for our government. And a problem I'm seeing in recent years is the government has slowly just been growing and growing and encroaching on these various amendments and restrictions and rules they have in the Constitution, whether it be the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, 10th Amendment. There's a whole bunch of rules I think the federal government is just blatantly violating, and I think we as individuals should stand up and we should be electing politicians into seats in Congress, into the Senate, into the House, even into the presidency. We should be voting for people that actually do adhere to the Constitution and do believe in the Constitution and understand the fact that the government is not supposed to be regulating every single aspect and part of your life. They're there to protect your liberties, and that is it.
So there's a lot that you kind of brought there. So unpacking that bit by bit, you mentioned, the Fourth Amendment in there. One of the big things that's, especially in the time that we've grown up, is like we're almost used to this like extra constitutional government that was promised to be temporary and very, very fading and only targeted on terrorists, that thanks to the likes of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, we learned has been targeted on each and every American, whether you've had contact with a terrorist or not, whether or not you have ever committed a crime in your life. Your information's probably being recorded. So kind of speaking on the Fourth Amendment a little bit, when you look back, where do you think we really went wrong in regards to all this, coming from a privacy standpoint?
Going up in a chronological order, I think it really started with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was an act passed under the Nixon administration back in the 70s. And originally, like you mentioned, when it comes to terrorists, it was originally there just so the federal government could spy on people they considered national threats, because, of course, this was during the Cold War, during the Red Scare. So their government was constantly on watch for Soviet spies and other communist spies. So they passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, in the hopes that they could catch these spies, but it's grown to such a point with FISA that now if they perceive you as even being connected to a potential foreign threat, if your brother's sister's roommate's friend went on an ISIS website or something like that, the government is then going to look into your private online records. They're going to look into your phone, your emails, everything. And I think that's just a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment.
So kind of looking back at some of those, going back and eliminating what was promised to be temporary, in a way, kind of repealing the, what's that saying? I think it was Friedman or someone who said that there's no such thing as permanent as a temporary government program. And when it comes to violating our civil liberties, I guess that is also increasingly the case. And, I really want to get your opinion as a student of political science and history on here. What do you make of some of the Fourth Amendment violations that started in immediately in the post 9/11 era? The Patriot Act, we had the Freedom Act, which was supposed to rein in versions of it, but that, assuming that our intelligence agencies are following the law to any extent beneath the surface.
Yeah, I mean, just being blatant, I'm just disgusted by them. I think they're, again, like FISA, they're a violation of our Fourth Amendment rights. We're just opening the floodgate and letting federal bureaucrats and politicians just go through our private information and our online property. And I think that's just disgusting. It's completely against the Fourth Amendment. I would rather have freedom than complete security. What was it Ben Franklin said is, if you sacrifice freedom for security, you're not going to have either. So if you keep passing things like this in the hopes that they're going to make you more secure, when the politicians promise it's going to help keep you safe from terrorists or communists or whoever, I think all it's going to do is it's going to end up with you and every other American losing more and more of their freedom and rights.
And you talked about security, and oddly enough, one of the things in the Constitution that one of the only places other than, chartering the military where it says anything about security is actually in the Second Amendment. So kind of transitioning over to that, I know that you mentioned kind of in your introduction the Second Amendment. What's some of the stuff that YAL does on that front?
So recently, at least with our chapter at NDSU, we recently did a poll at the NDSU Memorial Union asking students if they think NDSU campus should be a gun-free zone and whether or not they think you should be able to conceal carry firearms on the public land there. And the overwhelming majority of the people we surveyed there said they did not want it to be a gun-free zone. They said you should be able to conceal and carry on NDSU campus. And I agree with them because it is public land, it is tax-funded land, it is federal land-grant university, and I think you should be able to exercise your constitutional rights there, whether it be your First Amendment or Second Amendment.
And so kind of bringing this from the local to the national perspective, there's obviously been tons and tons and tons of news since Columbine, arguably since the 94 semi-automatic or assault weapons ban was signed by Clinton, that there's been a lot of both misinformation and outright bias towards the Second Amendment. And to be honest, though, admittedly, it hasn't always been held because the people that oftentimes claim to stand up for the Second Amendment really only stand up for it when certain subgroups of people exercise that Second Amendment. We won't go into needless detail, but let's just say that those who have traditionally been the standard bearers haven't necessarily done a good job of treating everyone equally in that. So with this Second Amendment issue, I want to first off talk about self-defense. It's one of the most underrated aspects of the Second Amendment because there's a lot of, I guess you could say, hot takes thrown around there about the Second Amendment. So per the Foundation for Economic Education, they say that more people use a gun each year in self-defense than die in car accidents. They put that number at between 2.1 and 2.5 million defensive gun uses each and every year. So I kind of want to start on a small scale, and let's talk about why this Second Amendment was brought up in the first place, why it made it into the all-important Bill of Rights. So you maybe want to help us go down that road?
Yeah. So, the Second Amendment exists because when the Founding Fathers first created the Constitution in 1787, they had just got done fighting a war with a tyrannical government that was taxing them without representation, that wasn't treating them as equals, and that's the reason they created the Second Amendment. They recognized the fact that governments can be tyrannical, even if it's your own government. And they wanted to give the American people the ability to fight back against their own government in case the U.S. government ever became tyrannical and started violating the rights of American citizens. And I think that's incredibly important. I think the Second Amendment is one of the most, if not the most important, constitutional right we have, because it gives us American citizens, the everyman, the ability to defend all our other rights against the encroaching federal government.
Now, there's a really broad history about the Second Amendment here, but I kind of alluded to it earlier. I kind of want to ask, I assume that you would call yourself a libertarian?
Oh, yes, most definitely.
All right, and this is a conversation that I think that all of us that are passionate about gun rights, I know that even a lot of the Democrats in this area are big on the Second Amendment, is that I really think we need to get our messaging right, because I think it's really important that we see that, for as horrible and wrong and anti-Second Amendment, as bad as their outcomes are, the left does have a unified talking point, and they kind of seem like they're the more empathetic ones. So what do you think we as, some might throw on the term libertarians, some might say classical liberals, some might say conservatives, gun rights enthusiasts, whatever you might want to call it. What do you think are some of the ways that we can really bridge that gap, if any?
I think the biggest is education, because I personally have talked to quite a few, gun control advocates, to sound nice, and a lot of them don't know that much about firearms themselves. A lot of them haven't even held a firearm. They've never fired a firearm. They don't know the difference between a semi-automatic, a fully automatic, break action, lever action. They don't know the different calibers, magazine sizes. They just don't know anything about guns. And I think that's the biggest thing we as gun rights advocates can do, is actually educate them on, this is what an AR is. This is what a semi-automatic is. This is what a fully automatic is. These are the different calibers of firearms. And go through and actually educate them on what it is, because a lot of them, when they hear things like AR-15 or they hear things like an assault rifle, they immediately think to just things they've seen in pulp culture. They think of it action movies. They think of people shooting hundreds of rounds a second out of a giant machine gun and killing dozens of people. And that's just blatantly not true when it comes to most guns.
And so I guess if there's anyone concerned with that has the interests of us gun-loving Americans at hand listening, community outreach, something that we are desperately needing, and unfortunately hasn't been a lot of communication between the two sides, and there seems to be a lot of bad blood, and I don't like when bad blood gets spilled over amendments that are supposed to protect us all, right? This shouldn't be, I think when you get to the core of it, no one likes thinking of what we see the outcome of gun control being, but the fact of the matter is that the best thing, at least when it works well, the best thing for whatever minority group down to the individual is having a well-armed, well-respected, property rights respecting, if you will, society, because that's really the closest thing to equality that you really can get,
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And like I said, it's all, in my opinion, about education. There's a whole bunch of facts about firearms that a lot of people don't know, because you mentioned the one from the FEE. Another one that I recently learned that I learned through research for our gun survey is that in the United States, you are more likely to be struck by lightning than to die in a school shooting. And that's something you don't really think about, because whenever you turn on the news, the media is so sensationalized now that anytime something happens, they got to turn it into a massive story. They got to turn it into a catastrophe. And I think that's a really bad problem we have right now in America, is that everything is so polarized and sensationalized in politics and in the media and in pop culture that it's incredibly difficult for people to try to bridge the gap and actually come to common ground and come to an actual reasonable conclusion, because everyone is so polarized that they just want to stick to their guns and stick their heads in the sand, and that's it. And I think that's a huge problem we have.
So if you could talk to, I don't know, maybe some of our listeners would consider themselves for one reason or another in the polarized group, what would you, and you're obviously someone with very strong political opinions, or else you wouldn't be on the radio talking about them. But what do you think we can really do to, because, every political scientist and every news commentator says that, oh, we've got to reduce the partisanship, we've got to come to an agreement. How do you think what do you think are some of the practical things that we can do to get to bring the civil back into civil society?
Yeah, I think I think it just starts at grass level. It starts with working within your own state. Because I recently read a great article called "The Renationalization of Congress," which talked about just how Congress and politics as a whole, slowly since around the 1960s, just got more and more and more partisan and divided. And it's not about the individual anymore. It's about the party. There's no split ticket voting. There's no going across the aisle. It's your party, and that's it. And I think that's a huge problem. I think it's a problem that we have such, I'd say, a fanatic devotion to the two most prominent political parties in our system right now. They are not the end-all and not the be-all. They are not the only political parties that have ever existed. And I think, like I said, it starts at grass level. It starts with you voting for someone at the state level, not because you like the party they're part of, or they are the quote-unquote lesser evil of the party. It starts with you voting for someone, whether they're a Republican, Democrat, a Green, a Libertarian, an Independent, whatever. It starts with you voting for someone because you actually agree with their beliefs. Don't vote for the party, vote for individuals.
Bringing it back to a closer nucleus of focus, if you will, on what they're actually going to do once in office. Because I don't know about you, but watching a lot of these, what you would call the Republican primary, because Trump's steamrolling it anyhow, but watching the Democratic primary and those who are trying to fight Trump, it's like, it kind of seems like everyone has one or two mantles that they want to pick up, and that's it. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like there's like 2 or 3 Democrats running, and there's just slight variations of each one.
Yeah, I'm already a pretty cynical person, but watching through the Democratic debates on CNN, it's just driven my cynicalism just through record highs, because, like you said, we have a stage full of like a dozen people, and they're mostly just parroting the same thing, and they're tripping over each other to try to prove that they are the most progressive, that they want to give out the most government benefits, that they care the most about minority and underprivileged groups. You had in the first debate Castro and Booker and O'Rourke arguing with each other in Spanish over who cared the most about immigration. And to me, that's just disheartening, seeing these people fight each other to try to give more government benefits from taxpayers and restrict rights even more. And I honestly think on the Republican side, it's not much better. I'll admit it, I voted for Donald Trump in 2016 just because I was not a fan of Hillary whatsoever. But I've honestly just grown to just be completely disheartened with what he's promised. The bump stock ban, the pushing for red flag laws.
The $1 trillion deficit.
Government spending has gone up. Military spending has gone up. We're at, $23 trillion right now in debt. Hasn't repealed any of these massive spending. He hasn't pushed back against the war on drugs. He hasn't done drug reform. He had Sessions for his attorney general for the longest time, and even after he fired him, he still didn't do anything about fixing the war on drugs. And it's made me cynical about both parties entirely.
And then, not to mention, I was reading on the news today, the guy that I got my start in politics supporting, the first guy that I ever took seriously, Rand Paul. Even he's looking like it's weird, but did Rand Paul turn into a rhino overnight? Like, somewhere along the way of trying to speak into Trump's ear, I think he got his own spoken to in a time or two. And that really I know that Rand Paul, a lot of people will call me like a fake libertarian or whatever because I said that I ever supported the guy. But it seems like we've lost I guess both parties have lost a lot of what made them in the first place, you know what I mean? Say what you will about the Democrats, they're offering a lot of really out there proposals, but at least we have a pretty solid guess that they're going to follow through on this stuff when they get elected.
Yeah,
at least I think they're attempting, to be honest.
They're they're honest, but the problem with me personally is that what they're honest about scares me a lot. Like, just we're already at $23 trillion debt, and you have people like Warren up there promising free college, free Medicare, free Medicaid, free healthcare, just like all this free stuff that's going to be paid with tax dollars. So they're either going to have to borrow more money and go more in debt, or they're going to have to raise taxes on people. And they always promise, oh, we're not going to raise taxes on the middle and lower classes, only on the 1% of the 1%. But if you actually look at it, even if you liquidated all the assets of the richest people in this country, all their assets, and you took all that money you got from that, you could run the government for, I think it was like 4 months, I read. You could run the federal government for 4 months. If you took all the wealth of people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, liquidated all their money, and pooled it together, them and all the other billionaires run it for 4 months. That scares me, seeing this massive spending. No one's proposing a way out of it. They're just digging deeper and deeper and deeper. They're not acknowledging the threat that's staring them right in the face.
And that's one of the things that you brought up that I'm really going to try and hit the nail on again and again and again in this show, is that it's gotten to the point where I think the only way that we're really going to be able to get out of this is through a whole lot of critical thinking and a whole lot of challenging authority. Because as I've said earlier, as I will say later, listening to this blind authority hasn't really gotten us into good positions. It hasn't done anything to safeguard our First Amendment rights. It hasn't done anything to safeguard our Second Amendment rights. It hasn't safeguarded our Fourth Amendment rights. Pretty much all that we've done over the last 20 to 30 years, well, I mean, that's when it intensified. You could argue the last 50 to 100 years, depending on when you want to start your time frame, is enable the rich to get richer off the backs of the poor and middle class through the government. And what's really interesting that they managed to do this time around is they managed to trick those people that they're taking from, that they're somehow going to benefit from it. One of the things that makes me really sick is that you have these people that say that, like, poor college would help poor people, or forgiving student debt. Forgiving student debt would help people like me. I'm already pretty solidly middle class. Me and my wife both have an education. We have debt because we had the education, but we didn't have to cancel our college career because we had some unexpected medical tragedy or something like that. We're not the people that they're alleging would be helped, but we're the people that would be helped. Do you know who isn't helped by forgiving student loan debt? Those that were so poor that they never could take time to take out loans in the first place, and those that never had the time and the opportunity cost to go to college. And those people would be left completely in the dark. And yet they're blatantly lying about it. This free college proposal is a massive gift to the middle and upper class off the backs of the lower class.
Yeah, I think it's really a problem with our education system, is that it's constantly, when you're in middle school, high school, they're constantly pushing you, go to college, go to college, go to college. Even if the college you're going to is incredibly expensive, it's going to put you 6 figures in debt, and you don't even know what you want to do at that college. I think that's a huge problem with our education system. They're not saying go to trade school or take a year off and just work in the private sector and figure out what you want to do with your life. It's just hammering home that you have to stay in the public education system and go to this college and get a degree in something you don't even know anything about or have a desire for, go 6 figures in debt, and then you're going to be burnt out and you're going to be angry because you have a degree that you can't use and you're 6 figures in debt and you're 25.
And by the way, you're not allowed to declare bankruptcy on that loan like anything else, because the federal government, since prices started skyrocketing, actually just before, instituted a policy where every dollar that's given out for a federal loan is backed by the federal government. So those people that are loaning out money at interest can't lose on their bets, which is not a fair system and has fed into the oversupply of college degrees, which has further increased. It's just a vicious, vicious cycle. And I don't know I don't know anyone that personally profited off of it, but I'm willing to bet that most of the people that saw benefit from this cronyist cycle weren't the ones taking out $50,000 loans to go to a school. It wasn't the people taking out 6 figures to get an English degree. It was the people financing the degree. And until we have more conversations like that and more of an encouragement and critical thinking, we're never, and it's sad as a society, we're never going to get beyond the base level. And we need to, I believe it was, there's a really great, I'll try and give him credit if I think who it was, who said that we need to move beyond level 1 politics for people, because people see an immediate action and an immediate result. And our job, if we are to do anything useful at all, is to get people to question what happens in the whole system, not just point to point. So with that, thank you so much for coming on. This was my guest,
Ezra Gray,
he is the
president of the Young Americans for Liberty chapter at North Dakota State University.
They have a great Facebook page. Give them a like. Feel free to reach out. I believe, when do you have your meetings on NDSU's campus?
We have them weekly at 6 o'clock on Tuesday. So actually, we're having one tonight at 6 o'clock in the Meadowlark room.
Yeah, that is this is done on a Tuesday. Don't know if this'll that won't go out at quite that time, but Tuesdays at what time?
6 o'clock.
So if you're an NDSU student or you know anyone and it sounds good to you, stop in, say hi. Thanks so much. This has been the Crazy Libertarian. I have been Bradley Foster with my awesome guest Ezra Gray, and I will be right back. This has been Bradley Foster, the Crazy Libertarian. I'll see you here next week at 8 a.m. on 88.1 FM. Have a great rest of your week.